Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing part 2 of the top 50 books, specifically fantasy books of the last 5 years. And this is technically part 2 of a video series, so within each part I am looking at books that were really popular and well loved and praised within the given year that I'm talking about. So for part 1 we did 2020, for today we're doing 2021, and we're going to do this all the way up to 2024. It's kind of a fun way to do a look back at what was considered to be the best of fantasy within those given years. Simultaneously, aside from this just being a reflection about books over the last 5 years, it's also kind of a look into the fact that over the last 5 years, I have been experiencing the grieving process after losing my dad in 2020. I am going to start with that portion and then we'll jump into the book stuff. If this is a little too heavy for you, or if this is not really what you were looking to listen to, then of course feel free to skip ahead to the book related things. But I wanted to do this just because I feel like, and I stated this in part 1 and I'll keep it brief for part 2, but I do feel like oftentimes, especially because people I know come to my channel to hear about book related things, that I keep personal life things out of the picture. But I think a lot of people online do that or they talk maybe too much about their personal lives. Regardless, I do think that in my case, I tried as much as possible to keep things related to books, even though the last 5 years have been really, really challenging, as is the case for anybody who's experienced the loss of a loved one. The grieving process is something I just find that a lot of us don't necessarily talk about unless we have a book that's sort of a vehicle to have that discussion. Otherwise, it just seems like something we experience in such isolation, even though it's something so many of us are going to experience in our lives if we haven't already. And I just kind of wanted to have an opportunity to ensure that everybody has a chance to feel seen or heard, or maybe they'll see a different angle of the process than even what they experienced, because we all, of course, experience these things differently. And then if you haven't gone through this before, it might give you some insight, or maybe it'll make it that much easier to be a good friend to somebody who is experiencing this sort of thing. So I'm going to start with that, then we'll segue into the books. I'll have the timestamp in case you'd like to skip ahead. There's one other element to this, because we're talking about some sad things, that I wanted to also highlight good things. And that is by mentioning charities that I do feel like in some way tie back to the kind of person that my dad was. So for part 1, I mentioned the Phoenix Children's Hospital because my dad had a big heart for kids, and also he grew up in Arizona. He was born in Arizona, so it felt fitting to have that be almost like a little piece of him. So I'm going to start with the charity. The charity that we're going to be highlighting today would be Doctors Without Borders. I'm sure many of you are aware of Doctors Without Borders. The idea is that they are an international group who try to provide medical care to people, especially in areas where there is some kind of crisis occurring. The reason that I wanted to mention this is because I feel like the basic essentials of life is something that my dad didn't really have a whole lot of in his early life because he grew up in such an extreme level of poverty. So for example, my dad grew up picking cotton, specifically in Arizona, and he also experienced a lot of homelessness as a child, or just having a lot of exposure to really, really bad living circumstances, and it did impact his health. He ended up getting skin cancer because he was outside all the time. And then also, for example, his teeth, he ended up losing his teeth at a pretty young age in his early adult years because of the fact that he didn't have a lot of dental care when he was really young. And all of this, I think, really ensured that he had a very strong grasp and understanding when it came to people who genuinely don't have the most basic of things and essential things. And Doctors Without Borders, I think, tries to ensure that people have that. So I wanted to mention them. Plus, on top of all of that, where the Phoenix Children's Hospital, I felt represented an aspect of him when it came to where he was from. At the end of the day, doesn't matter where you're from. My dad definitely was the kind of person that he just kind of saw people as people. He understood that a lot of us are plagued with the same challenges in life, and he would do what he could to lend a helping hand. So I felt like Doctors Without Borders, in a sense, sort of represents him, but also ties into the fact that we're all more united than maybe we think. So if you're interested in checking out Doctors Without Borders, I'll have, of course, them linked. But now just mentioning very briefly what 2021 was like for me when it came to what was going on after losing my dad in 2020. It's weird to say that the thing that stands out in a sense the most is the probate process, but that was a part of all of this that I don't find that anybody ever talks about. So that felt like such a, I don't know, a kick in the face on top of everything, because most people, when you experience the loss of a loved one, you have the things that you know that you have to deal with. So not only you have the emotional things, but typically there's some form of, funeral arrangements or some kind of service or cremation, depending on what you and your family and the person wanted. But regardless, you have that awareness, but then the probate side of things, because I was the one that was responsible for all this, it's so tedious. It's so tedious. And it's such a constant reminder, because you're trying to move on with your life. You're trying to at least get some semblance of normalcy again. And probate is a constant reminder, like, hey, I don't know if you remember, but like this family member of yours is dead. It lasted so long. If you don't know what probate is, the idea is basically, and I'm not a legal expert, so, maybe look into it a little more. That's not the point of what I'm talking about here. But the idea is that when somebody passes away, in case they had any debts, then there is a period of time where whoever it is they would have owed money to, they have the opportunity to say, hey, that person owed me money. And then that lasts for a certain period of time. And if nobody comes forward, then that door closes. So this way, 10 years after somebody passes away, there can't be some random group that shows up saying, like, actually, they owed me money. So that's the idea behind why probate exists. It's actually, in a way, trying to protect the individuals who perhaps there was a will and they left certain possessions behind and that sort of thing. It's just to make sure that you don't have people trying to take everybody for all their worth after the fact. But we all know, especially if you're an American, that dealing with like city government and paperwork and just the tediousness of it all, it's so unproductive, it's so unhelpful. Like, imagine going to the DMV or MVD. It's called different things in different states, but the DMV, where you go to get your driver's license and kind of that kind of stuff. You know how everybody dreads it? Okay, imagine that. For months. For months, you have to keep going back. You have to keep doing stuff. And then you got to try to get family members to cooperate. And this family member's not responding. And then this family member's like, why do you need this information? You're just like, oh my gosh. And then at the same time, you're like, I'm still sad, by the way. I'm still sad about all this. But I just, whatever, I guess. So you just, you're kind of in a frenzied state. But you also know there's this feeling of like, well, everybody's waiting until you finally show how sad you are. So you just gotta like try to keep it cool all the time. But really, you're just a bundle of emotions. So that was what 2021 was like for me. And you know what? The books that came out that year, I don't know if they helped, because I feel like I didn't have any, to use a common internet word, there were no bangers really for me in 2021. It's the only year, as we go through all 5 years, it's the only year that there was not a single book in the absolute top tier for me. And in fact, all the books that were in the bottom tier, they were all from this year. All of them. None of the other years, spoiler alert, none of the other years as we go through are going to have books that I put in the bottom tier. It was just this year. So on one hand, I'm like all upset, and then on the other I'm also like, can any of these books be good, darn it? So anyway, I want to reiterate that I am pulling from books that were within the Goodreads Choice Award nominees, and I know that's not necessarily the best means of gauging quality or how impactful a book is or anything like that, but the reason I'm choosing this is because I want it to feel somewhat community oriented and also sort of a snapshot of that year and what was considered among fantasy fans, considered to some degree the best of the best. Again, I know it's not the best means, but it's the one that I'm using for this. And I wanted to incorporate, speaking of a community angle, I wanted to gauge a little bit of what all of you thought about the books that came out that year. So I had a poll, and I will continue to have polls. So when this video goes up, there will be likely a poll already available for you to vote on for 2022. And I choose 4 books from this year and ask you which one's your favorite among these. So the options for the poll from this year, we had Shadow of the Gods, The Witch's Heart, Under the Whispering Door, and She Who Became the Sun. And Shadow of the Gods won overwhelmingly. I was a little surprised to see just how close the other 3 were. So The Witch's Heart was at 10%, Under the Whispering Door was at 15%, and She Who Became the Sun was at 14%. Of course, there's only going to be so many people who voted in this poll that have read all 4 of these, but those were the results. And I also like Shadow of the Gods, but I also liked The Witch's Heart and She Who Became the Sun. So that one was, that would have been tough if I were to vote in this, which kind of to some degree I'm doing that a bit by having a tier ranking, but I don't have to pit them against each other so aggressively. I don't have to pick just one. I get to just put them in tiers. But Under the Whispering Door was not one I would have, that one, absolutely, I would not have been pondering like, oh, do I like this one as much as the others? Because I didn't. And on that note, let's jump into the tier ranking. We'll start in tier 4, and I'm going to go through these pretty quick. So in tier 4, we have A Master of Jinn. I liked aspects of this book, especially toward the beginning portion. I thought that the world was really fun, and also just in general, the setting itself was a lot different from what we typically see in fantasy, and I appreciated that element of it. I was invested for a while, and then at some point, I wasn't really as much anymore, and I have considered going back and rereading it, but it truly is one of those books where I just didn't come away from it feeling emotionally impacted. I liked the creativity, but I didn't think it was so creative that I was enamored or wowed by what was done with the world building necessarily. There is a little bit almost like of a mystery component to this, and I don't know that I cared that much or was that on the edge of my seat, but I also wasn't annoyed by it by any means or thought it was the most predictable thing ever. It just truly was sort of one of those, you just kind of come away like, oh, I read that book. Another one in this tier is For the Wolf. So this book definitely kept me turning the page. It's this forest setting where it feels like we're on the brink of absolute destruction. And I liked that feeling. It has a bit of a Beauty and the Beast feel to it. Beauty and the Beast and then Little Red Riding Hood to some degree. The idea is that the character has to be sacrificed to the wolf, which is this being that lives in the woods. And that's meant to protect everyone else. And then things are not what they seem, which our protagonist discovers when she is sent to this place. And there's a lot more to what's happening with the woods than what she ever knew before. So there's sort of this discovery aspect of it. But once again, I kind of mentioned that within this tier, there's the, maybe I'll read the sequel and see how I feel. I read the sequel, and then what I described feeling for A Master of Jinn as an example of just sort of like, okay, I read that, I guess. That's kind of how I felt about book 2, and book 1 I didn't love so much that I thought it carried me through those somewhat more neutral feelings of the second book. It was just sort of fine for me. And then the other one in this, it's one of the only books over the course of all of the books that we're going to be talking about that I technically didn't finish, and that would be The Jasmine Throne. And I almost never let myself include books that I didn't finish, but I read quite a lot of this one, and thus I felt like maybe there's a chance I could at least chat about it a little bit. This one seems to work for a lot of people. I was very, very intrigued by this. I thought all of the various moving pieces on the board were having something engaging happening in their plots, but there are a couple of aspects to this that weren't quite working for me, which is why I sort of put it down, because I had a feeling that if I completed it, I would feel the way I described feeling about the other ones in this tier. And one of the things is that, having actually read a couple things by this author at this point, I'm finding that this seems to be a common thing that is utilized, and I think it works for some people, and it doesn't really work for me. It can work, but it hasn't worked thus far. And it's the idea of when two characters somehow are forced to interact with each other, or they meet each other, and they aren't engaging in insta-love. It's not that. But there is this feeling of we immediately feel drawn to each other, and even if we don't necessarily even like each other that much, or even if we're in positions where our status would sort of pit us against each other, even if it's like that, there is still this, I don't know what it is, but I'm just drawn to this person. And it's not even necessarily just attraction. There's almost this feeling, almost, I'm not saying that's what is happening, but there's almost this feeling of like fate or fated mates, where something is forcing these two to be in each other's orbits and they can't resist that. And the reason that this tends to not work for me is because, and I don't actually like fated mates for this very reason, but it falls into this feeling where it doesn't quite seem as though we have to put as much into actually developing feelings for each other in the stories, or the interactions are just always rooted in this almost like ethereal, oh, why do I feel this way? It's something indescribable. And I do want to allow for the fact, of course, that sometimes we are genuinely drawn to people and we don't really know why, and we can't pinpoint it. But I do find that for me, in reading about these experiences, I just want a little more development that feels rooted in what's actually happening, not just like these floaty feelings. I don't know if that makes sense. Hopefully that's clear enough. But that was one aspect to the story. And then it just, as a result though, it ended up propelling the dynamics between these characters from 0 to, 50 really quickly after they met. And then I'm like, well, I mean, I didn't even buy into that first 50. So if you're now going to go from 50 to 100, I'm probably not going to be that invested because I didn't get what I wanted out of the foundation building. And then also, this is the dumbest thing. I know it's the dumbest thing. I've mentioned it before. It's not the book's fault. I want to make very clear. It's not the book's fault. I am so bothered by the idea of plants growing out of people. And that's a component to this, almost like this disease that's in this world. And it just is like the phobia that I have with tiny holes that a lot of people have. I can't. It's so challenging for me to get over this. I just mentioned this in an anticipated releases video, so apologies for the repetition. But this book had that, and it's really rough for me to get through. So that's another aspect. Again, that's not the book's fault. That's not the book's fault at all. But that was another reason I was like, I might have to put this down. It was more so the other stuff. I could have pushed through if I liked the pacing and the world and the characters. If I loved all that other stuff, I would have pushed through this part. But because I wasn't necessarily feeling fully enamored with the rest of the story, then that kind of just started to stand out a little bit more. Let's go to some positives, which would be tier 3. So for this one, we have... I actually think I'm very much in the minority with the two that are in this tier. We have Ariadne. I found Ariadne really frustrating, but at the same time, I think if you're going to do a retelling of the story, and you're going to stay sort of true to the original, it is a frustrating story. And I kind of appreciated that, but also I do feel like there's an examination of the way that we specifically view events through our own personal lens, and then we impose onto events that, as opposed to actually seeing things for the reality that they are, which is, I think, kind of part of what that story was portraying, even though all of the characters were driving me up a wall in that book. I also did like the writing of it, but I know that other people, understandably, are a little harder on Greek and Norse, I'd say pretty often, because those two are pretty popular. They're harder on those than they are retellings of other things, just because it's been done time and time and time again. And I think because people have a little more familiarity with those. And I respect and understand that. For me, that wasn't as strong of a component, so I recognize that part of why maybe I just saw it for the themes it was, I think, going for, as opposed to worrying about the accuracy to how it relates to the original, stuff like that. That wasn't as much a component, but I fully recognize and appreciate and understand why that's a component for other people. And I recognize that that might be why this one's a little lower than it was for me, but I did enjoy aspects of this one. And then The Wolf and the Woodsman. I think The Wolf and the Woodsman, from the little bit I've seen of other people's feelings about this one, it kind of seems as though a lot of people really didn't care for it. But then recently, and not that this is an indication that the times have changed, but I was just walking around this store the other day, and this one got a new cover, and it's redesigned, and it seems like they're leaning into the idea that this is a fantasy romance, which isn't quite how I would categorize it, but it seems like they're trying to present it as more that, and so I'm wondering, are they doing a rebrand to try to make more out of it, or is that who they genuinely think the target audience is, and they missed that the first time when it came out in 2021 because fantasy romance wasn't as big of a thing at that time? I don't know. Or maybe my recollection is off, or maybe genuinely we had this feeling where it was kind of liked, but also not as much, and then now it's way more liked. Maybe that's happened. But as far as how much I liked it, I did enjoy this one. For me, this was sort of almost like what I wanted from Uprooted, which I know that one's hit or miss for a lot of people. It was unfortunately a miss for me, which this book is by Naomi Novik, Uprooted is. And The Wolf and the Woodsman, it has a similar feeling in that you have this character who gets kind of like taken across the country, and then they start out in this woodland area, and then they end up even in this court environment, and it's kind of folklore heavy, and there's a lot of additional thematic elements that kind of seep into every little area they go to, and there's this general almost horror feel to a lot of the environment. So it has in my mind, some parallels to Uprooted. I just happen to have liked this one a little bit more. Going now to tier 5, we have 2 in this tier. There's 2 different books called Malice, so I want to make sure I explain which one is in this, but there's Malice and Saarland. Malice is a book where, I'm sure you've seen the cover, it's like a hand and then a rose. And I didn't dislike this one necessarily when I read it. And I thought, maybe I'll read the sequel. It's a retelling. But it's one of those books that it didn't sit with me hardly at all. And that's why I thought about putting it in tier 4, but I ended up putting it in tier 5, because I do think how much a book sits with you sometimes does illuminate how you truly feel about the book and how much of an impact it has. And why does it have an impact? Because there are some books I read or some stories I consume in whatever medium we're talking about where when I first step away from it or when I first complete it, I'm like, wow, I have a lot of thoughts, but I don't quite know how I feel. I have feelings, but I haven't quite pinpointed what they are. And then you just can't stop thinking about it, and the more you think about it, the more you're like, I feel like it's kind of brilliant, actually. And you kind of just sit in it, and you dwell in it. And I had the complete opposite of this one. I read it, and then after I read it, I kept, as I said, thinking, maybe I should read the second one. And then very quickly, I was like, I don't even really remember the first one, and I kind of just read it. Maybe I would reread it, and it would launch it up into, tier 3 or something. But for now, it's just in tier 5 for the lack of impact. Saarland, the opposite. I thought that the thematic elements of Saarland were fantastic. It was really weird and also very creative and horror leaning in a lot of ways. And this one, my biggest thing is the tone discrepancies is how I'll refer to it as. So there would be these really bleak, borderline almost disgusting things that would occur. And the way that they represented the thematic elements within this, I appreciated and I liked. And then sometimes we would have this almost, if it were a movie, it'd suddenly be playing this kind of fun track over a scene, and it's almost cool and quippy. And for me, that was such a bizarre shift. There's a scene where I think somebody's even like singing along to a Rihanna song or something like that, and I was like, what's happening? And that's, I can really appreciate a book going for it, and I can really appreciate a book deciding, you know what, this is going to be really serious and really campy at the same time. And sometimes that works so well for me, and I am on repeat in saying that when it doesn't, though, even just a tiny shift, suddenly it all kind of falls. It's like, I was about to make a really dumb comparison. I was going to start talking about Jenga. It's like everything fits, and then you just take that one piece, and all of a sudden it falls apart. That's a really dumb comparison, though. Did anybody ever play Kerplunk? That's what it was called, right? It's similar, where you have all these little sticks, I guess, and you have to pull them out, and there's stuff on top. And then at some point, if you pull the wrong one, they all fall. It's a very similar game to Jenga, but with a fantastic name. Kerplunk, that's a great name. I would play it with my grandma before I went to school when I was a kid. That's kind of how the feeling, back to the point, I had about the camp versus the serious factor in this book. And then tier 2, I do have Shadow of the Gods in tier 2. I really like Shadow of the Gods quite a lot. Obviously, a lot of you seem to really like it as well. It's just not quite one of my all-time favorites ever. And I think the reason is because even though I like the setting and I like the characters and the plot, I was constantly engaged. And I also, because it's multiple perspectives, I always found, this is a big compliment I gave to it consistently as I talked about it in various wrap-ups and read across the series, is that it was not one of those more epic type stories where when I would come back to it, I would be annoyed if I was with one character and then grateful when I got to the one I liked. I always felt like the characters took turns being the most interesting character, and I think that's really difficult to accomplish, so I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I just don't know that I ever felt anything that hit me too much emotionally, so as a result, that's why it's here. And I think similar things can be said about Witch's Heart and She Who Became the Sun, which are the ones that are also in this tier for this year. Really like Witch's Heart, really like the writing, really like the way that the story, there's just a tiny little bit toward the end that sort of reshapes your entire view of all the events that happened. I like the protagonist. I like the way that we kind of subtly dissect the way people treat each other, the way that you have this character who is willing to do anything for her children, and truly, when we say anything, like, what does that mean? And you explore that. But then also, maybe so are other people. And maybe that's what is pitting us against each other. I really, really liked all that. And then She Who Became the Sun. Really enjoyed this one. I do think there is a certain point into the story, all of a sudden, we are going from, we were primarily following one character, and then all of a sudden we're following a bunch of other characters, and you have to get caught up really fast. You have to really be like, okay, hold on, who's who? Why does this person hate this person? Why does this person want to go to war with this person? And why does it seem like the reputation of this individual is so reliant upon this showdown with this character we followed before, and everybody's kind of despicable. And I did enjoy all of that. Once again, I don't know if there's anything that emotionally gutted me, though. But I still need to read the sequel. I meant to read it earlier this year, and I didn't, and I'm disappointed in myself. But maybe that would bump it up as a whole, as a duology. Once I read the sequel, we will discover that. And then as for the ones at the bottom, we have The Chosen and the Beautiful, A Spindle Splintered, Orchidea Divina, and Under the Whispering Door. So Under the Whispering Door took the aspects about, because I mentioned in part one, I didn't love House in the Cerulean Sea. I really love the themes, and I really appreciate what it's going for. However, it was a little too almost cotton candy cute, where I felt like I wanted just a bit more substance, and I wanted the main protagonist to have a little bit more personality. This one, it's like it took the things I didn't like about that book, and then also irritated me. Because the main character, rather than just being sort of this empty vessel for this nice man to kind of be like, what if you were nicer though? And they're like, what if I was nicer? Maybe I should be nicer. Instead of that, it was just a really apathetic, but beyond apathetic. It was just this juvenile blech of a person. And then we have this other individual just basically trying to explain common decency to them. And it was annoying. It was annoying. And it's also one of those books where it's like, yeah, you know that's where it's going, but I prefer shifts in characters to happen maybe over more time, or it doesn't even have to be that much time, but also I don't want them to feel kind of cartoonish to start, because then it takes some of the realism out of the character development for me. Also, I don't like when any kind of, especially if it's a romantic relationship, I really don't like when it feels like one person is so much more emotionally intelligent than another person, because I'm like, why would you be attracted to somebody that you basically had to train? It's just not for me. And also, it is in some ways about the grieving process and death. And I can be very picky about how that kind of stuff is done. And this one just kind of didn't really work for me. So that's why it's in the bottom. Orchidea Divina, I will say, it's not this book's fault, because this book did this very well. But books that explore various different generational perspectives hardly ever seem to work for me, and I think the reason is that because you're looking at these pieces of, in this instance, this family, you're looking at these pieces, and then you're kind of taking those, and they all contribute to a greater theme. I think that's wonderful, and that's a really cool way to tell a story. As somebody who's a very character-driven reader, though, I always want to spend more time with the various different characters from each generation, and then when we don't, it just feels like it's not as full as I want it to be. And that's not, again, that's just a certain way of storytelling that it doesn't mean by any means it's bad. I just want to be clear if it wasn't clear already, that in the bottom tier, I don't think that these are objectively bad books. It's just that that aspect of this didn't quite work for me. I'm not opposed to trying more books with this general setup and then seeing if maybe there are ones that would work for me. But thus far, I haven't really come across one that I love. The Chosen and the Beautiful is a Gatsby retelling. And oddly, my problem with it is that it's too similar to The Great Gatsby. There were scenes that played out almost it was almost identical in the dialogue, in the setup, how we got there. So I wanted a little bit more. The idea is that you're following a different character as the protagonist, and then also you are seeing how this character is treated as a result of being an Asian American woman, as opposed to viewing this story through the lens of who we typically have as the protagonist. And I liked that idea, and I think I just wanted it to do that a little bit more and maybe deviate the tiniest bit. Not that the plot needed to change, but some of the scenes, it's like, I don't know if I needed those to play out in such a similar fashion to the original. And I think if we're gonna lock in on this other character and we're going to incorporate additional themes, I just wanted those a little bit more. And it's kind of short, understandably, because The Great Gatsby's pretty short too, but I wanted a little bit more out of that one. And then A Spindle Splintered, what I described about Malice is somewhat similar to this one, where it didn't ultimately have that strong of an impact, but also I don't mind when stories at all are wearing their themes on their sleeves. I don't care if your themes are really, really subtle or if they're right in front of your face. But I think I find that if they're going to be right in front of my face, then I also want to have them not feel like you have to explain everything. Because it's like, if they're really overt, then maybe don't also explain them. Because it's like, yeah, I got it, because it's really obvious. And a little bit, I feel like the story was just kind of a little heavy-handed, and it's a novella. So maybe if it had been a full-length book, and then we could have stretched it out a little bit, and we didn't feel like we had to really make sure that we are clear about this theme, then I think maybe that would have worked for me. But in this particular instance, it did not. So that was my reflection on the reading of 2021's Best of Fantasy, as well as kind of some of my own personal experiences from that year through the grieving process. And I don't think I said it in this video, though I said it in the one for part 1, that the date that part 1 went up was actually the 5-year official anniversary. I hate that word in relation to this, but it was the 5-year anniversary of my dad passing away, which is kind of what prompted this. And obviously now we have moved past that point, but it's still rooted in that idea of reflecting on both this and also personal life at the same time, because we can't separate books from the experiences that lead us to feel the way we do about them. And I felt like that was a good way to kind of showcase that, while also just kind of having a fun little tier ranking and chat through about these. Now, as we segue into the other years, we're going to have these probably about 3 weeks apart from each part. So part 1, part 2 were 3 weeks apart. We're probably going to do the same things for part 3, 4, and 5. And then that will kind of lead us nicely into predicting what are going to be the best of books for this year. Of course, the landscape looks very different now that fantasy and fantasy romance are separated. And so I think it's really fun to see what gets highlighted now that we have those distinctions. But also, I feel like there's been a lot of criticisms about what's been popular in new fantasy this year and just new fantasy releases in general. And there's a lot of conversations to have. And I think that by having this reflection back on 2020 through 2024, then it makes the conversation more enriching as we talk about 2025. But anyway, that's it. Feel free to let me know where you most agree and also where you agree the least. Luna Bear is giving me cute little faces. I think she wants her lunch. So I'm going to go feed her. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye. Okay, Luna Bear. Oh, are you going to turn your head? There you are. Hi. Oh, yeah. Let's get you some food. Okay.